Next month we have a very special presenter who's agreed to come from South Surrey. It's Barry Roberts. He's the owner of Heritage Hydrangeas, which is a demonstration showground, and he travels the world acquiring, samples of hydrangeas from different parts of the world, and has helped in development of them. And so he will be coming to speak at our regular Wednesday evening meeting, which is, somebody stole my agenda. March 2nd. Oh, you're going to be away?
No, I think one sister will be here. So
oh, okay.
Yeah. I was just afraid I was picking one up that day, but I'm not.
Yeah,
so
yeah.
Okay.
And he has a lovely slideshow prepared for us of all the different varieties of hydrangeas and how to care for hydrangeas and the different kinds of hydrangeas that are cared for in different ways. So.
And while you're still standing, you try to introduce our speaker.
Oh, yes. Where is she?
You stepped out for a second.
Uh-oh. Well, there, you see, we did end up boring somebody.
Here she comes.
Here she is. I'd like to introduce Amber Kelly, who's driven up from Bellingham today. She's the, let me see if I get this, the coordinator that he has agreed to come talk to the community on composting, recycling, and sustainability. She's going to begin with a short presentation about this, maybe 20 minutes. The presentation, by the way, is going to be, for the first time ever, prepared for live streaming on the internet, courtesy of Bennett Livesteam. And after that, we're going to take a walk out to the community garden in the back to take a look at how a composter would decide how to design a composting system for a particular situation. You will take questions throughout and at the end?
Mm-hmm. Yes, don't hesitate if you have a question within the presentation, and afterwards we can stop and take things slow and get into a discussion. Also, my formatting got a little bit wonky when I transferred it over, so if there's something that is too small and you'd like me to read it, just pipe up and I'd be happy to do that. So thank you for that introduction. If you're familiar with the Master Gardener program, we're in a similar vein. And we do a lot of work in community gardens because there's a dearth of information about composting out there. So many gardeners are lifelong learners, and they love to be outdoors, and they do a great job with the plant side of things, but when it comes to the decomposition and closing that loop, there's a lack. So that is what we're trying to accomplish today, making sure that you have all of that information. And composting is relatively simple to do once you get the hang of it. And that's my intro. So, why compost? Some of this presentation sort of focuses on the household side of things. How many people here compost at home already? Awesome. Okay, so we've got some experienced people in the room, I assume. Any worm composters? All right. Pot composters? Just throw in a pile and see what happens, composters? That's beautiful. All right. Today I'm going to go into the nitty-gritty of the science of decomposition, and again, feel free to ask questions. We don't have to focus on that though. My aim is not to teach you how to compost perfectly, but just to get the general sense of how to do it out there. And so much of composting is art guided by principles of science, and it's going to be a different experience for every gardener, every climate, every unique set of feedstocks or materials that you're putting into the compost. So you start with these principles and guidelines, but when it comes down to it, you have to be one with the pile and just keep an eye on things and see how it goes, and that's going to give you your best chance of success. Some of the benefits, horticultural benefits of compost: keep soil loose and well drained. So if you have a clay soil, it'll break it up a little bit. If you have a sandy soil, it will help retain moisture. Prevents soil compaction and erosion. Supplies nutrients for plant growth, as I'm sure you're all familiar. And when a plant is healthy and well supported, it is better at resisting pathogens. So in that way, it supports plant health as well. And then there are some more philosophical sides of composting that I like to reflect on. It's the ultimate form of recycling. It's a responsible thing to do, to keep your materials on site rather than driving them somewhere else, or even worse, throwing them into a landfill, which breaks my heart whenever I see organic matter in the trash can. Think of it as being a stored of energy transformation. All of the organic things, materials, paper that we have around us is ultimately energy from the sun that's been transformed and that we're able to use. And so to waste that is a real shame. It's nice to be able to return that to some form of usable energy for us. Do you mind if I sit?
No.
And then here's a few of my favorite quotes from Aldo Leopold. Land then is not merely soil, it is a fountain of energy flowing through a circuit of soils, plants, and animals. And then there are 2 spiritual dangers in not owning a farm. One is the danger of supposing that breakfast comes from the grocery, and the other that heat comes from the furnace. Which, again, I like to reflect on these because it is easy for us to take for granted all of the how easy it is to survive nowadays, but composting is an essential part of sustainability and being self-reliant. And as food gardeners, I'm sure many of you also value those ideas. Some more benefits of compost from a horticultural and environmental perspective. Again, nutrients, moisture retention, buffers against pH. So if you're in an acidic area or alkaline for some reason, it'll help to buffer that out. Toxicants, heavy metals in the soil will be chelated with the organic matter in compost. So in that way, it can help to sort of act as a buffer for groundwater and just to kind of fix toxics in the ground. Some of that might be taken up into plants, but we don't need to get into that. It's great for soil organisms and the entire soil ecology. Compost is just one small aspect of soil science. Again, protects plants against diseases and pests, reduces runoff and pollution, sequesters carbon, and conserves energy resources. And I think I put this down here. Yeah, 2% of the natural gas consumed in the United States goes into the manufacture of nitrogen for fertilizer. So that's something, again, to think about when you are purchasing fertilizer. It's not just, hurting your pocketbook, but it's a huge energy expenditure for our nation and globally. Nitrogen is difficult to get out of the air. It takes a lot of work. There's only a few plants that do so. Legumes, beans, you might know, are nitrogen fixers. They pull it out of the air and put it into the soil. And unless you have a chemical process to do that, which is dependent on fossil fuels, it's hard to keep around. So it's a very valuable thing. And then compost can also serve as a mulch. There's a lot of things that you can use as a mulch. And the difference between a mulch and a compost is that mulch is more of a protective layer. So that could be wood chips, it could be grass, it could be leaves, wood shavings. But compost can also serve as a mulch. So you don't necessarily have to till it into the soil. You can just put it as a layer on top, and it has benefits there as well. So structure, we already talked about that a little bit. Here are some of the organisms that you might see in your compost pile. Earthworms, obviously. Several different kinds of worms in a compost pile. And I have a slide on that later, but you'll notice that different layers will have, you have your large earthworms, your night crawlers. You have little red ones. If some of you have clay heavy soil, you might notice kind of these neon pink ones. Is any of this ringing a bell? So those red ones, the red wigglers, are what people tend to use in indoor worm composting systems. Those thrive in organic matter, that's what they eat. So those are very much drawn to your compost piles. But the other kinds of worms will kind of work their way in there too. It's just good to know the distinction. You don't want to bring, for example, night crawlers into a compost bin or a worm composting bin. They won't survive. There's worms that burrow and aerate the soil, and then there's worms that tackle the organic stuff. And those are the ones that we want to focus on for composting. These are actinomycetes. If you're familiar with the sort of earthy smell of dirt, that's what these give off. They're kind of like a mix between a little animal and a fungus. Are you familiar with slime molds? Kind of a strange creature. That's actinomycetes. I think they're really cool. And then this is my little homage to Beatrix Potter. She was a mycologist, amateur mycologist, and an author, as you might be familiar with Peter Rabbit here. But fungus thrives in the compost pile. And then you'll have your ants. They're fine. All of these things, I mean, if you see it in the pile, it's doing something. It has a purpose. So I wouldn't be fearful of any kind of critter that you see in there. The exception would be centipedes because they can bite. So, but that, controlling that is up to you, I suppose. Fungus gnats, these are pretty common in indoor bins. If you have an indoor worm bin, you might see fungus gnats, or in your potted plants. Flies, lots of different kinds of flies, beetles. These are all physical decomposers, so they help by just chewing stuff up. Millipede, centipede. These are fine. Don't worry about them. You can pick them up, hold them. They're kind of fun to play with. These might bite, so they look a lot scarier too. Mites, you'll see a lot of tiny little white things, and they're either springtails or mites. Both great. I guess the mites can be sort of a yellowish brown color also. Pseudoscorpions, these are also very small, but if you see one of these, don't fear, it's just another decomposer. Roly-poly bugs, here's the springtails, and also quite small. Any questions about compost organisms? No? All right. And the composting process. Essentially, you are adding carbon and nitrogen into the system to support these organisms, your fungi, your actinomycetes, your bacteria, and they're using that material to grow and develop, and they release carbon dioxide and water, and that's the complete cycle. It's pretty intuitive. For food scrap recycling, which we might do some of that in the community center, you have a lot of different options. It can be anything from a hole in the ground that you bury your food scraps in, and if you're worried about pests, animals, you can use something like a burn bin, like a metal trash can with holes drilled into it. Bury that, throw your food scraps in there. Works great. Worm bins are my personal favorite. They're fun and they're very effective. I actually have some worm compost if anybody wants to check it out, or I might pass it around as an example of what finished compost looks and smells like. So I'm just gonna open this up and send it. I pulled this out of my worm bin this morning.
Where do you get your worm bins?
I make my worm bin. It's pretty similar to this.
You're just using like
Rubbermaid bin. They're about $10 at Fred Meyer. Drill holes in it. I also have some worm bins made out of scrap wood that I nail together. Basically just a box, four walls and a lid, and that's all it takes.
You need some air.
Yes. Yeah. Well, so I find that with wooden bins, I don't need to drill holes. Seems to air up pretty well. It has a really nice moisture content. With the Rubbermaid plastic, you have to be really careful not to let it get too wet, or it can get kind of gross. But we can certainly talk more about vermicomposting if that's something that interests everybody, or we can chat later. Choosing a system. Sorry, black text. So it comes down to how much space do you have, how much time do you want to invest in this project, how much labor are you willing to invest in the compost, how much you want to spend, what your neighbors find acceptable from an aesthetic standpoint or perhaps from a smell standpoint. And then pathogens, if you have sort of gross things that you'd like to try composting, you have to be much more diligent in maintaining your system and ensuring that it heats up. So that leads me into hot composting. Has anybody here tried hot composting? How did it go?
Not well.
Not well. Yeah. It seems like a big, scary thing, but if you have the right, if you start off on a good foot, it can be pretty straightforward and really cool to watch. and fast. It works really well to break down organic material quickly. And then you can start to compost sort of trickier things like, I don't know, maybe a pet waste that you don't want to throw out in a little plastic bag, you want to try to compost it. And so you can start to get a little dangerous like that if you want to experiment. Cool composting, it needs a lot less maintenance. Again, you just kind of throw it in a pile and let it happen, and it'll happen, but it can take a long time. And it also doesn't kill pathogens, if that's a concern. If you have weeds, diseased plant material that you want to be able to use your compost again, you need to be ensure that it heats up. And by heat up, sort of the benchmark is 110, 113 degrees. Your different compost organisms will succeed at different temperatures. So most of the insects that we looked at earlier, those are going to be active at 70 degrees and below. 70 degrees is sort of the ideal range for many fungus also, fungi, but they can get into the hot range. And then your bacteria, there's different kinds of bacteria. Some of them are thermophilic, which means they thrive when it's very hot. And so once you assemble everything and you have the perfect recipe, and you put it all together, those thermophilic bacteria will take off. And your pile can get up to 130 degrees in a couple days if you have that stuff all assembled, if you do everything right. And it can sustain that, depending on the size of your pile, it can sustain that temperature for weeks. And then when it starts to cool down again is when you want to mix it and reassess, maybe add more materials. But we'll get into that a little bit more later. So carbon-nitrogen ratio. Has anyone heard of this term? Carbon is going to be your browns. So that is leaves, wood chips, sawdust. Sometimes manure. Manure can be tricky depending on how old it is. Nitrogen is your greens. So that will be any fresh plant material. Also manure sometimes. Food scraps. And what carbon basically is the building blocks of your microbes. And the nitrogen is the energy that they use to, go forth and prosper. So it's important to have both of these things in balance, and that's what the ratio is about. So the target ratio that you want is 20 to 40, and what that means is 20 parts carbon to 1 part nitrogen. Again, nitrogen is a hot commodity in nature, so you don't need a ton of it, but it is important. And again, building a successful pile is just as much an art as a science. So you can get very detailed with this. There's a compost calculator that we have on our website where you can enter the volumes of all your different feedstocks and calculate exactly how much of each thing that you need and how much water you should add. But ultimately, you just kind of have to feel it out and try it for yourself. And that experience is going to be the best teacher. So for you folks that have piles that you just kind of throw stuff in and that it takes a long time, part of what is probably happening is those materials are drying out, and once a green dries out, turns brown, it becomes a high carbon material. When you have too much carbon, it takes a long time to break down because there's no energy in there for the microbes to use. And again, if it's too high, you don't have the building blocks. If the nitrogen is too high, you don't have the building blocks. So they have the energy, but they can't do anything with it. And then if you have too much nitrogen also, you'll get an ammonia odor. And if anybody's brave enough, I have a sample of what that smells like. But you can use your nose. Your nose is a great tool in assessing what is going on with your pile. If it smells funny, then something's wrong. It should smell good and earthy. If it smells like ammonia or strong or bad, what's likely happening is it's wet in our region. It's probably too wet. And what happens when compost gets too wet is it goes anaerobic. And we are going for aerobic composting. That means it has oxygen in it. If it's anaerobic, it'll still break down.
Is the solution to that to turn the compost?
Yes, to turn it, also you might want to cover it if it's rainy. So in the summer, it's very dry here, you need to add water. In the rest of the year, you need to keep it covered if there's downpour, because if you fill all of your pore space, your air up with water, then you are essentially going to drown your microbes. I kind of like to think about the compost pile as like a pet, or like, you know, it's like an organism that you need to take care of. It has all of the basic needs. This is coming from somebody who started composting in her dorm room, so with worms. All right, so here are just some examples of different feedstocks that you might use and their ratios. Again, it depends, it's variable, so you can't pay too close attention to the numbers, but just as a general sense, if you've got grass clippings are awesome for compost. They work really, really well, and those will just heat up by themselves. The trick with grass clippings is that if you just dump them in and you don't mix it up, it mats, forms layers. Has anybody seen this happen in their piles? So again, you need air, and those mats will go anaerobic. Water won't penetrate as well, air won't penetrate, and it's not going to break down that well. If you keep it mixed up, then it's going to be wonderful.
So even if you've got some weeds in the grass clippings and that sort of stuff, that doesn't matter?
What do you mean?
It depends on the weed.
Okay.
Yes. Okay. So if you have like noxious weeds that you don't want to spread in your garden, you need to ensure that your compost is getting hot, like over 113 degrees, ideally up into the 130s. And a compost thermometer helps with that. You can buy them at Garden or
like at all times or just at certain times?
It needs to sustain that temperature for a couple of days at least.
Okay.
So and like I said before, if you assemble everything perfectly at the start, it should only take a few days for it to start heating up. So measure the temperature. It'll sustain itself. Once it starts to cool down again, that's when you mix it. You don't want to disturb the microbes when they're like really digging in. You want to kind of let them be.
Okay.
Is this chart on your website?
You know, I don't think so, but I can add it. Our website is going through like some renovations, and so I'm starting like a mini site for my stuff.
Like the resources page.
Yeah, I have a sign up sheet on my computer that I'm gonna have you folks add your names and email addresses if you want more information, and I can send you the link to our resources. So back to this, there are some things that you can add that you might not have thought of, like cardboard. Like you're not supposed to recycle, for example, greasy pizza boxes. So if you have the stamina to rip all that stuff up, it's a good brown for compost. The trick with composting year round is that you'll have a ton of green materials in the springtime, but not as many brown materials, and vice versa in the fall and winter. So what some people will do is they'll like stockpile fallen leaves, for example, and just keep a big reserve of leaves to add to their compost piles in the spring. In the fall and winter, it can be a little bit trickier to find green materials, but a good source of that would be if there's a farm nearby where you can pick up horse manure. That can help to get things going. I mean, mowing your lawn, again, as long as you have grass to mow, that's a really great feedstock. Coffee grounds are pretty good for compost as a nitrogen source. And food scraps. And we can talk a little bit about food scraps and predator concerns, or pest concerns later, but I would encourage you to try composting your food scraps. Mm-hmm.
You said newsprint, but can you also, like, when you shred, stuff in your shredder,
Mm-hmm.
can that go in the compost?
Absolutely, and the jar that is being passed around now. Did you already get a chance to sniff this or look at it?
Yeah.
Okay, so you'll see that there's some nice plastic in the top. So this is, what all of this originally was shredded paper for my office.
Okay.
I mean, that's almost all that was in here. These worms were kind of not getting a lot of attention.
Okay.
So, and actually that's the truth. This was a box of shredded paper with water and worms added to it, and abandoned in my garage for 4 months.
Wow.
And
Okay.
this is, so.
Cool.
But, so if you're shredding stuff, I mean,
Yeah.
you might want to try to cut out the windows first.
Yeah.
I don't know why they put those windows on envelopes. It's really annoying.
Can you talk about fireplace ash?
Could you repeat that?
Fireplace ash?
Yeah, I don't know much about ash. What have you heard about the
Very
rationale? Would that be to balance out pH or something? Yeah. So, if you're worried about acidic soils, you can add ash directly to your soil to balance that out. But what's happening in the compost pile, I mean, it's undergoing a lot of chemical change. So even if you start out with acidic materials like pine needles, for example, when it's composted, it's going to be pretty neutral. You won't end up with a finished product that's very acidic or basic. And that's part of the buffering property that finished compost has. It'll help to neutralize soil as well. It acts as a good buffer for acids and bases. So I wouldn't add anything like ash if you wanted it to be more alkaline, or some people want like an acidic compost if they have blueberries or something like that, for example, but it really isn't going to make a difference. It's all going to be different when it comes out at the end. A few more other things you can compost at home that you might not have thought of: stuff from your dustpan or your vacuum, fabrics, if they're not mixed fabric, if it's like pure cotton or wool, you can compost that. You can compost hair, you can compost latex. And urine is actually an excellent source of nitrogen. So if you need to give your pile a little boost, you can pee on it. All right, here are some quick recipes. Quick recipes, just kind of rule of thumbs. If you want to try to get a hot pile, these work pretty well. So 2 parts grass to 1 part manure, that is almost guaranteed to heat up. And that would be one of my recommendations. Also, 2 parts grass to 1 part leaves is a great ratio. And as a general rule of thumb, roughly equal parts browns and greens by volume will probably get you to where you want to be. But again, you have to keep an eye on it. Things that are hard to digest: large pieces of wood and branches. Heavy cardboard or cardboard that you haven't ripped up, if it's just a sheet, again, because that is going to mat down and cause anaerobic conditions. Grease and oil, I mean, you can compost it, but it just takes a while. Roadside plant material, the reason that this is on here, it's not hard to digest, but it's something that might have some toxics or things that you don't want in your garden, so I would avoid it. And then this actually acidic plant material. Oh yeah, that's fine. So it just takes a little bit longer. But like I said, when it comes out in the end, it's going to be mostly neutral. And then here are just the basic things that you need for your compost to survive and be happy. Air, it's like combustion, hot composting. It needs oxygen. And if you have more oxygen, you have hotter compost. And so a great way to ensure that your pile is well aerated is to raise it off of the ground. And once the pile starts to heat up, it actually, convection will take place, and it'll suck air in through the bottom and kind of keep itself aerated. And that will reduce your need to turn it overall. You can also do something when you're building the pile, insert poles or sticks into it, and then over time you can just pull them out, and then you'll have some natural channels for air to run through. Sunflower stalks can work well for that, and they'll just decompose in place also. And then to raise it off the ground, you can use a pallet or you can use a brush. If you have a bunch of woody, branchy stuff that you're trying to compost and it's probably not working, you can repurpose that as a base for your pile. Water, again, you don't want it too wet or too dry. It should be kind of like a wrung out sponge. If you poke it, it should have a little bit of a spring to it. Shelter. Most of this is moisture control. You can use a tarp for moisture control. You can use hay. You can cover, like at home, I usually just throw a big piece of plywood over my wire bins like this. Porosity and particle size is a very, very important thing. We're going to talk about that in just a second, but that's something to keep in mind with the structure of your pile. And then if you want it to get hot, this is another problem that people have. You need to have a critical mass size of a cubic yard. A little bit bigger is better, but if you want things to really move along, you need something that's about this big, full. And this will maintain the heat. The size will stay hot, so you can be composting in something of this size in the dead of winter, and it'll be 100 degrees in the middle of the pile.
How long is that piece of wire meant?
10 feet. So you can buy a roll of, it's 10 by 3 feet at the hardware store. It's about, I think, $15 roughly for hardware cloth. Nice thing about hardware cloth is that it is difficult to get into for pests. If you're worried about rats, for example, what you can do with something really simple and cheap like this just put a sheet of cardboard cloth on the ground, put this on top of it. You can cut out a lid maybe with a latch, or just put a piece of plywood or something over it, and then you have a pest-proof composting system. Really easy to use. Once you have it filled with materials, you can just talk to people who have different methods. And you can unlatch it. Got latches here. You've got do the bottom one. You can just open it up, move it somewhere else, turn your pile. What you can also do though, if it's full, is just dig out a little portion, add your food scraps, for example, cover it back up. And that is sort of like a slow, go in rotation, and that's a slow way to aerate and add materials at the same time. It works really well, it's really easy, low labor, effective way to compost food scraps throughout the year. Okay, particle size. I think this is the most overlooked and the largest problem in community gardens, particularly also in home gardens. If you're not chopping everything up, it's gonna take forever to break down. So again, I'm assuming that if you have a pile that you just kind of throw everything into, you still have like full stems poking out and viney stuff all over the place. You really want to avoid that. It'll look neater and it will actually decompose quickly. So I have a picture here. Hold on. This is a community garden that I attended to over the summer. And so what you have in this bottom layer is, first there's just dirt, sod, root balls people threw in the bottom. Then there's a nice layer of grass. It was really interesting. This corner of grass was composting, and then this corner was like, it looked fresh as the day it was added.
Like a mat.
It was totally matted, it was dried out, and it was just, nothing had changed. And that was because of differences in how it was mixed up in moisture, but you could just see in the same layer, different management conditions in different corners, what a difference that made. And then on top, you just have I think that's probably zucchini or something, some kind of a summer squash. So what we did is we pulled all this stuff out, we chopped it up. At the end, it filled up the bin to about this high, and then it got hot right away. It heated up and it broke down. It looked beautiful. So this is the part that takes effort, chopping things up, but it's the most rewarding thing that you can do if you're serious about managing your pile. Because again, everything will break down eventually, but composting, as an act is ideally is the management side of things, is doing something with it to promote the best conditions for decomposition. So chop it up. You can throw it on the ground, go at it with a shovel or a machete. I like to use shears, and you don't want to do it all at once because that again is going to take forever. But just as you're adding things, just chop it. 1-inch pieces are best, but even just tearing things in half or into quarters before you throw it in, it'll go a long ways. And if you have a lawnmower, if you put everything on the ground and run it over with a lawnmower and then add that to the pile, that'll also get hot really fast. That's what we do at our demonstration garden in Hovander, where we have a ton of materials to get through. We just mow it all up and add it in, and then within a month it's broken down. Okay, back to the slideshow. Where is this? Oh, and again, this is all about making the microbes happy. So if it has a greater surface area, if it's smaller, has a greater surface area, there's just more access points for them to eat. And it also helps to keep things aerated and kind of broken up. It's good to have a little bit of heterogeneous mix as far as particle size to help with the aeration, but on the smaller side. And that also, by the way, is an important reason to have water in your pile also, because the microorganisms, like where the decomposition is actually taking place, is in that thin film of water that's coating everything. So keep that in mind. Here are some general guidelines, and you can look at this later. It'll be, again, up on the website. But I guess the things that stand out are try to keep things under 3 inches in diameter. 2 inches ideally, but like if you have branches, don't add them if they're big. You can do twigs, they're still gonna take forever, but big stuff, that's best to put somewhere else and figure out what to do with it. And has anybody heard of hugel culture?
Who?
Yeah.
Hugel culture is sort of a trendy permaculture thing that people have been trying.
Scott's our Google master. Scott.
Really? Awesome. Okay, well we should talk about it. But this is something that, trying to figure out what to do with woody stuff. I've been experimenting with the hugel culture. It's where you bury your wood, logs, decomposing logs typically, but I've tried it with smaller sized wood and branches. And the idea, and then you cover it with soil and compost and plant into it. And the idea is that as the wood decomposes, it helps to regulate moisture and release moisture when it's dry. And there are some other benefits. Mixing, again, you want to make sure everything is mixed, not only to aerate, but also just because you want it to be kind of homogeneous. And what else? Yeah, just keep an eye on things. Play it by ear a little bit, keep an eye on it, and make adjustments as you go. A few more recipes. We already kind of covered this, so this will be on the website. And then when it's ready, it smells earthy. I mean, it looks like this, essentially. It should be crumbly, won't keep heating up. I would go with your nose on that one. If it smells earthy, and if there aren't very apparent big pieces of things that haven't broken down, it's good to go. And if you really want to, you can screen your compost and get out all of the really finely decomposed material and add back in leftover bits and pieces that need a little bit more time. You don't have to do that though. Application, if you're gardeners, you probably are familiar with applying compost. Add a 1/2 inch to 3 inches directly onto the ground, or you can till it in. And then here are just some examples of different piles. You can just throw it on the ground. You don't need a containment system. This works just fine. It's just a little bit harder to turn. It looks a little messier. We've got straw on top of this one. The straw is great at retaining moisture on the inside and keeping it out during rainfall. This is my personal favorite system because it's so inexpensive and it looks nice and it's just very easy to use. So that's why I tote this around with me. This is kind of similar if you prefer a square bin. Pallets, a lot of people make bins out of pallets. Again, it's really inexpensive to do. And if you wanted to pest proof this, you could line the pallet with hardware cloth.
Are these all at the demonstration garden?
No, they're not. These used to be. This is our demonstration garden, but the compost program went out of commission for, 7 years. So we just came back this last year. So now what we have one of these, we have 3 of these. We have a large tumbler, and we have some cinder block bins, and we're hopefully going to install an in-ground worm bin this spring. Tumblers and these earth machine things, some people have success with them. I think that they're just kind of expensive and they don't work that well. The problem with the compost tumblers is that they can be really heavy to rotate, and this, for example, is so small. It's you need that critical size for things to heat up, ideally. So it is, again, don't work that great, but they work well for some people. And an advantage here is that it's up off the ground and it's totally enclosed. So if you're worried about pests, and this is a great option, you just have to put a little bit more effort into making sure that things are moving along. If you just kind of throw stuff in there, you're probably not going to see a great result. A lot of people like to do these lidded bins, again, if they're worried about pests, and also because it just looks nice and neat. And you can make something really beautiful. This is made from reclaimed cedar from a person's deck project, and then they built a compost bin with everything that was left over in the end. And that on top is a screen for sifting the compost when it's finished. All right, so.
Is the 2-chamber system good because then you can start one and then when it's ready, then you begin the next one? Or?
Yeah.
A lot of people do that. You can have a 2 or a 3 or a 10-chamber system depending on how big your garden is. And the idea is that when one chamber fills up, you just move it over to the next one and then add material to the chamber that you just emptied. And that is it's a good management system if you don't want to be as diligent with the hot compost aspect. If you just want to add stuff and kind of keep an eye on it, but you don't want to have to, I don't know, like keep a calendar of when to turn your compost kind of thing. Yeah, you just move it over, and there's your aeration that happens every so often, just a little bit more organically. And you can do the same thing with these also. I mean, it can be a challenge with something like this where you have to pull it out and then put it into the next one. Some people find that a little bit too labor intensive. So it can be nice to have a bin where you can just unwrap
Do you
the
want
pile.
them to be in full sunlight or can they be in the shade?
Shade is better, but if it's covered, then it can be in full sun. But your concern there is going to be is moisture retention. Like, is it going to stay nice and spongy? You don't want it to dry out, because that will bring things to a screeching halt.
Should they be turned every so often?
Yes. And again, so with something like this, you don't have to track your turning as diligently. Just move it over when one bin fills up, and there's your turning. And if you're trying to achieve a hot compost pile, you want to turn it once the temperature declines. It'll heat up, and then it'll stay at a high temperature for a period of time, and then when it starts to go down, you turn it, add more air, and it might heat up again, or it might just be ready to settle.
Do you ever add dirt into it?
Yeah, adding dirt is a great way to get some starter microorganisms.
That's what
So I would do that, but if you're adding stuff from your garden, then there's going to be everything that needs to be in there will be in there. You don't have to go overboard with additives. Some people do get really into, like, we have one master composter volunteer who has a what's it called? A collection license, like shellfish and seaweed. So he'll go out and he'll collect seaweed and like dry it out and add it to his compost for whatever benefit seaweed has. But you don't have to go. Or some people will add blood meal for more nitrogen. There's different things that you can do, but I like to keep it simple. I like to just use what you have, and it'll be a good product in the end. And so many of the benefits of compost aren't even the nutrients. It's the mulch. It's the protection and the moisture retention and the impact that organic matter has in soil, and all of those things that support plant health. Maybe not directly contributing nutrients to it, but that's what really the value is, in my opinion. That's where you're going to see the biggest benefit, not necessarily in the nutritive values. So for successful community garden composting, my tips are to appoint a manager. Somebody needs to be on top of it and managing it, because if it's if there isn't a leader, then more likely than not it's going to fall into disrepair. There needs to be somebody who's really comfortable with directing the way that things are added or fixing a problem if a problem arises pretty quickly. You want to keep it neat. Just think back to that picture I showed you before. Keep it really simple. Start slow. Don't try to compost everything right away. You want to familiarize yourself with the materials that you have on hand and make sure that you're going to be successful. And then good signage is essential, so I have some signage here that you guys can hold on to. The tools that you need: clippers, hedge trimmers, shears, a machete, a shovel, anything that you can use to chop up your stuff. It's essential. There's just no way around it. But again, that's the labor-intensive thing. Most people think of the labor-intensive part of composting as turning everything. If you process your materials beforehand, then everything is going to be so much easier down the road. And the aeration aspect doesn't have to be that tough. But a pitchfork is useful for the turning when you do it. Gloves, a thermometer can be really handy if you want to keep track of those benchmarks and know when to turn it if it's cooling down, but you don't need one. Just use your eyes and your nose. Your nose is a pretty useful tool in assessing your compost process. And then just a really quick, the key points: browns, greens, air, and moisture. Mix everything up. Make sure that the water is not too much or too little. So cover it when it's rainy, and then chop everything. I mean, if you do these things, you're going to be successful. That's really all you need to do. Adding materials, don't add too much soil, what happens with soil, if you add a root ball, it just sort of clogs things up, slows it down, makes it hard to manage. I mean, it's not going to hurt anything per se, but again, that picture I showed you before, the whole bottom layer was just sod and root balls, and it was nasty. And don't dump your grass clippings on top, whatever you do. Just mix them in a little bit even, but don't just dump them because they'll mat up and form a layer. In a community garden setting where you don't have as much control over what people are doing, I would just completely avoid anything thorny, anything diseased, weed seeds or heads. I mean, if you have weeds, try to pull them before they go to seed so that you can still compost them. But seed heads and rhizomes, just don't add them. Anything over 3 inches in diameter isn't going to break down. It's going to clog everything up. And if you're not sure, then just don't add it. Again, keep it simple and go slow. Just throw it out if in doubt. And I'm not going to go into vermicomposting unless people have specific questions about it. But here's a nice illustration of some of the worms that you'll see in a compost pile, just for your curiosity's sake. So, you know, there's a lot of worms out there. There's not just one type. All right, is there any other
So what about pests and composting?
Right. So what pests are you concerned about most? Rats. Yeah, that's the usual one. Again,
Raccoons too.
Raccoons.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so if you're worried about raccoons, that's a little bit trickier because they'll be attracted to smells and maybe they won't get into the bin, but you just don't want them around your house and your yard. So the trick there is to either have something big and wooden, for example, that closes up, or just to make sure that you're managing your pile, because if everything is decomposing properly, you know, if the pile is constructed properly, especially if it's getting hot, but not necessarily, it shouldn't smell. And you can, again, add food scraps to it and it won't smell. That's going to be your best deterrent for pests, is just make sure that you're not just throwing things in. Certainly make sure that if you're adding food scraps, they're covered or buried. Don't just have them sort of hanging out. There is another community garden that we tackled last spring. Similar issues, a lot of big viney stuff, a lot of really wet patches and really, really dry patches. And then there'd be like the odd tomato just sort of dangling out, or like some squashes in another corner. And they had a major pest problem, and it's because they created a perfect environment for rats where there's a nice brushy sort of covered protected area with little bits of food dangling out for the taking. So if everything is chopped up and all of your food is covered and buried, it won't smell bad. It's not going to attract stuff in the first place. But if you already have pests on your property and they're inevitably going to get into it, hardware cloth is your friend.
Sorry?
Hardware cloth.
Hardware cloth.
That's what this is called.
When you say, is that what that is?
That's what this is.
Oh, okay.
It's a little bit more durable than chicken wire. Chicken wire, like raccoons can tear that. Does anybody keep poultry? Chickens? Or
People here who do.
yeah. Well, so like when you're predator proofing your chicken area or your duck area, you use hardware cloth. This is like the animal prevention technique. So I would do the same thing for
And
compost.
so on the bottom then, would you put something on the bottom as well?
Yep, yeah,
Yes.
it can be as simple as just laying a piece down and setting this on top. Once this is full, it's stiff, you know,
Yeah,
there's tension there. So that'll stay in place. Or again, if you have food scraps that you would like to compost at home, outside, one of my favorite simple methods is to use a burning barrel, like a metal trash can, or you can make it yourself. Drill holes in it. You can use plastic, but rats can chew through plastic.
Mm-hmm.
Love it.
Yeah, but it's like nice and soft for their little teeth. But you can bury that, or you can leave it above ground, but it's gonna smell a little bit. You can bury that and just throw stuff in, and it'll break down. The critters in the soil will work their way in there. So that's a nice, easy method. I'll go back to the slide that shows what that looks like.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Moles. Do moles do anything with composting?
You know, I haven't had problems with moles.
Moles are usually insects in the ground.
Yeah, I mean, you might have voles that kind
Moles
of
would do it.
get in there, but
Alka-Seltzer works very good for getting rid of holes.
Really? What do you, how so?
Just take an Alka-Seltzer tablet and stick it in their hole.
What is, does it kill them?
Yeah,
Blows
they eat
them
them
up.
and they blow up.
Jesus.
Holes too? I don't know.
That's hardcore.
I don't have any, so I guess so. But he's got
I don't know if I
went
could swim
through
with that.
2 of the great big Costco-sized boxes of Alka-Seltzer last year, but we don't have the problem. And the holes are starting again now, so I'm gonna do it all before we plant this year.
Isn't that interesting?
We have a lot of bowls here that are the major food source for the herons.
Oh, really?
So we have a big.
Well, they can still eat them, it won't hurt anything.
Yeah.
You know, if the birds want it, the Alka-Seltzer
You
is
know, I
gonna
don't
do
know
the
about
thing.
that. There's lots of things that kill up, so I wouldn't know
Yeah.
about Alka-Seltzer.
I mean,
I don't think it'd do anything, cause they disappear out of the yard, so
Yeah.
somebody's taking them and eating them, and we don't seem to be down on birds at all.
well, what I do for voles in my garden, because I live in a field basically, and we have tons of voles, is just to keep the area around the garden mowed down, because they like to hang out, you know, right at the surface and sort of tunnel through stuff. So keeping, you know, if you have flat pieces of like wood or I don't know, anything that just sort of provides that thin layer of cover, they'll go right underneath it. So keeping it kind of cleared out, keeping it mowed, I find helps with voles quite a bit. But again, if you are concerned about predators, either you can build, it's slightly more expensive and labor intensive to do, but very attractive, and then later easier to maintain, is a big wooden bin that's completely enclosed. That'll keep most things out. Rats, I would still line it with hardware cloth, just to be sure. Huge proponent of the hardware cloth. Oh gosh, what was I just? Oh yeah, cinder blocks. Cinder blocks are nice also. They're pretty cheap. They also look pretty, and you can assemble sort of a custom bin by hand, just setting them up. And because you need to be a little bit handy if you're worried about it toppling over. You might want to use rebar or a mortar, but you can do that. We have one of those at Hovander, and it looks great. Yeah. Any other questions about pests? Just line it with stuff and maintain it. If it doesn't smell bad, and especially if it's hot, things are going to be decomposing so quickly that they won't have a chance to get established and eat it anyways. All right, I think that wraps up what I have to offer. I can continue to answer questions if you have any specific things to your pile that you're curious about, any problems we can try to troubleshoot.
So meat isn't really a good thing, it doesn't break down that fast and stuff?
Meat is fine. It will break down fast if your pile is hot. The reason that you don't want to add meat usually is because of pests and because of the pathogens. Because you know it's could have salmonella or any number of things in it. If it's raw, I suppose if it's cooked, that probably won't be an issue. It also stinks when it decomposes. It's meat. But if you have a hot pile and you put it in there and you bury it, it's going to break down so quickly that you won't smell, and it'll be surrounded by earthy nice compost. You won't smell it. You can absolutely do that. And an old trick is just to bury your food scraps. You can dig a hole in the garden and bury it, and it'll break down.
You'll find the raccoons dig it up.
Yeah. Okay. So
that one system, which is the like for pet compost, it looks like a coffee mug over on the right.
This is that's a food digester. So that was
that also works really well for me.
Yeah. Right. So this is when I was talking about the burn barrel that you bury. This is the same principle. It's just a container specifically built for food scraps. I haven't seen those for sale locally. I don't know where you'd find one. You probably order one online.
I think I've seen them sold specifically for pet waste.
Yeah.
But you could use it
For anything.
meat scraps.
Yeah. And if
so
you
so you put pet waste into that pen?
Yeah, that is one way to deal with pet waste that you don't want to wind up in your food garden.
right.
Okay.
You have a place to put it.
Another thing that you can do with solid wastes. Has anybody here used a composting toilet before? Yeah, I love them. They're so much nicer than porta potties. They're so much cleaner and they're lovely actually. So what you do with the composting toilet is you essentially, your waste goes into a bucket and you add sawdust to it, a layer of sawdust. and once the bucket is full, you take it out. There's a small acres farm in Whatcom County. They'll throw parties, garden food parties, and they say that they measure the success of the party by how big the human waste pile is afterwards. But they'll have, they have a big old pile of, and so I went there the weekend after they'd had one of these events, and there's a huge pile, and you could stand a foot away from it, and it doesn't stink because it has all the right components in it, and it had a nice layer of sawdust on top, and they just let that sit for probably a couple years. There's no rush with that, and then it's fine. It heats up. It heats up, and that'll kill anything that's nasty that you might worry about. Then you probably still wouldn't want to use it on food.
I think Japan uses a lot of human preservatives.
Yeah, and Tacoma has a biosolids. So that's the word for it. Biosolids sounds a little bit nicer. They have a
It really
biosolids
depends what
program.
they put into it. Like where I used to live in California, you could go and buy the sludge from the place where they were doing water reclamation, but they put so many other chemicals, and people would dump all this stuff in the toilet, and you'd get horrible toxins, and
Yeah.
so you wouldn't want to use it.
Right. Well, that is a concern. That's a concern that I have. So my undergraduate study was in environmental toxicology, and there's so much that goes through, like, into the toilet that doesn't really get processed, even by the water people. A lot of pharmaceuticals and stuff like that. There just isn't a way to screen it out. So the contamination is everywhere. Yeah.
Will weed seeds decompose in a cold compost?
They won't. Nope. So if you're gonna do a cold system, just don't add weed seeds. I would do, you don't have a curbside composting program.
No.
That's too bad.
Part of the problem is the manure that you can get in Point Roberts is full of seed. So you
Okay.
wind up putting it in your garden, and next thing you know, you've got weeds from everywhere.
But the advantage with, seeds are really tricky. If you have a hot pile, compost piles can get very hot. You don't want them to go over 160 degrees because they can ignite.
I don't know if there's ever been a hot pile. It's a cold coastal climate.
Mhm.
So it's, there is half of the point that's a little warmer than the other half, but
Yeah.
not by much.
That's the thing about composting. So you might see when we're looking at those bins, those plastic bins that are black.
Yeah.
That's kind of
Most
marketed.
them get hotter.
So that's the gimmick, right? But the thing about a hot pile is that the heat isn't coming from energy from the sun. It's all internal. It's all from microbes.
Well, and there's not enough air going through that.
Right. No, these things don't really work that well. They're expensive, and they don't really do anything.
I've had some luck with just putting weeds into black plastic bags and leaving them sit.
Yeah, that's a good technique because that will get very hot. From the sun.
And it's just brown and green from the root ball of the weed, and not all weeds. That's what she was saying.
Yeah.
Not all weeds work. You'll open it
Yes.
up, and some will be just as good as you would.
Yeah.
8 months later.
Right. So concerning weed seed in manure, if you have grass clippings available and you want to experiment, I would do that ratio of 2 parts grass clippings to 1 part manure. It should get hot. Get a thermometer. If you don't want to buy a compost thermometer, I suppose you could use a meat thermometer, just kind of dig in there and stick it in, or like a candy thermometer,
If we
anything.
buy a compost thermometer, we share.
Yeah. I should have brought
The
one.
library, check it out at the library.
That's a great idea. That's a great idea. Yeah.
I love it when it comes back.
It has to have its own little container.
Or it does, load out some pieces.
Yeah.
Well,
It's a great new coloring books, we can make it.
experiment with it though. Try that. Give it, in 2 months, if it's well managed, it'll be done. It'll break down. I mean, that's the fast track, but you can have finished great compost in a couple of weeks. And then have a test plot and put down the compost and see what happens. And the chances are, if it's hot enough, if you're like 150 degrees for a couple of days,
It will kill the seeds.
it should kill the seeds. I'm sure there's always going to be exceptions with some really nasty stuff, but see what's in there and see how it goes.
Yeah, I agree. We don't get straight from that.
Yeah, or just do that. Keep it simple. Don't worry about managing killing your weeds. Just don't add them. Yeah, that's an unfortunate thing that you don't have curbside.
I have too much organic material to
to just compost, like it is more than going to go into my pen.
Okay.
And in the fall, I usually put the leaves on top of vegetable garden, so them up there in the winter.
Right.
So in the spring, is that okay?
That's great.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, leaves, they're a great organic mulch. And again, one of the best benefits of compost in the first place is just its mulch characteristics. Retaining moisture, protecting plants. So that's an excellent. Or you can share them. You can share them with your fellow gardeners because they're all
Some
good.
people layer, you know, the lasagna gardening, right?
Yeah.
Some people layer.
Yeah, there's that layering and compost is probably a concept that you've heard of also. So I would just quickly dispel that. It'll still work, but it makes a lot more sense to mix it all together. Just mix it all up. Layering is a little bit easier if you're working with different things at different times, but mix it up. Any other questions? Anything that I can elaborate more on that maybe I glossed over or spoke too quickly? Okay, well in that case, I would like to go take a look at the garden.